All right, I think we're going to get started. So I'm Karen Turco. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Cool. All right. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us at the California Conference on Library Instruction. So I'm Karen Turco. I'm chair of CCLI Steering Committee this year. This year we have a 100% online conference, which is new for us. And so we're really happy and thrilled that more people than usual can join us from a wider geographical area. So that's really exciting. And thank you for doing one more Zoom. Maybe it's the last Zoom of your semester, who knows? But yeah, thanks for joining us. We're excited. So I'm a public services librarian at Sacramento City College, which is a community college in Sacramento. And CCLI itself is planned annually by a steering committee composed of academic librarians from around Northern California. So that's our theme for this year. And I'd like to first thank our steering committee. So you'll see these names again at the end, but this is the group of wonderful people that have put this thing together. It takes us almost a year to plan it. And so thank you so much for the steering committee, for your dedication and your hard work and your planning throughout this pretty challenging year. Next, I would like to thank University of San Francisco, specifically Sean Calhoun and John Bancevich from USF. Normally we do have our conference at USF. So USF is still supporting us this year, so thank you. Also, thank you to Alternative Communication Services, ACS. So this, the keynote will be captioned this morning. So this is the first presentation, which we call the keynote. Okay, so then housekeeping stuff. This is the code of conduct that should be put, the link will be in the chat in a moment. So our code of conduct is basically just to keep our conference free of harassment, trouble, anything like that. So if you do need help during today, at any point with code of conduct violations or anything else, just technical help, you can just look for someone with CCLI. All the steering committee members have CCLI in front of their name, and then we have the virtual background. So that's that. Okay, so for our land acknowledgement this morning, we at CCLI acknowledge that this virtual conference is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. So I work and live in Sacramento, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Nisenan. Normally, our in-person conference takes place in San Francisco, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Ohlone. So those of us in CCLI, we encourage each other toward difference making. And so those of us who are privileged and who are settlers in this country can make a difference as allies to those experiencing or dealing with the effects of racism or oppression of any kind. So we wanted to just provide some links and things to look at for you to look at later. There's a really good land acknowledgement toolkit. And there's some links here you might be familiar with. I wanted to highlight in particular, We Here, that bottom one. So Anna's going to put all these links in the chat. You can check them out. So I'm happy to announce that this year, just based on our theme, we managed to we're going to make a donation. It's going to happen next week to an organization called We Here. And so that's specifically relevant to our profession. It supports Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our profession. So check out that, but it's a really cool organization. You can check that out. So thanks to everyone on CCLI that helped make that happen. All right. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so that's our theme. So just a few words on the theme, and then we'll get going with our keynote speakers. So we are drawn to this theme because it really speaks to the evolution of library instruction toward critical information literacy and anti-racist pedagogy. The pandemic made our support of our disproportionately impacted students and colleagues even more urgent because we all moved to 100% online. We could see those existing inequities become even starker. So today we're really grateful to our speakers who are going to shed some light on ways in which we can more fully support and engage our students while breaking down structures of oppression and white supremacy. So this brings me to our keynote presentation. Really quick housekeeping notes first. So the keynote presenters will be taking questions at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, the keynote presentation, you can put these questions into the Q&A function, okay, in your bottom of your screen. That's Q&A. So that will go to the presenters who will, again, at the end, they'll be taking questions. And then if, as an attendee, you would like to chat with one another, you toggle to chat with all panelists and attendees. And I think people have the hang of this, but we wanted to just get that out there. Okay, so now to the fun part. So our keynote presenters, our honored keynote speakers for today. Nisha Modi is a librarian at UCLA with experience serving as the Associate Director of the Network of the National Library of Medicine, Pacific Southwest region, and as a Health and Life Sciences librarian as the liaison to the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Wynn Tranfield is the librarian for Physical and Basic Sciences at UCLA. She works with undergraduates, graduates, and faculty to refine knowledge synthesis practices, build information literacy foundations, and explore collections through a critical lens. Doug Worsham is the Digital Experience Manager at UC San Diego, has a background in instructional design and student-centered pedagogy. Doug works to continually improve the holistic user experience. Okay, so on behalf of the CCLA Steering Committee and all of us here today in attendance, I extend a warm welcome to Nisha, Wynn, and Doug. Please take it away. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Wynn Tranfield. I'm a science librarian at UCLA. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Doug Worsham. I'm a digital experience manager at UCSD and used to work at UCLA with Wynn and Nisha, and my pronouns are he, him.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nisha Modi. I'm a health and life sciences librarian at UCLA, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
And we would like to address that we're using technology enabled by a corporation headquartered in what is now called San Jose, California, on the traditional land of the Ohlone and Tamian people. In order to facilitate the use of this technology, global lands and peoples have been deeply affected by the construction and development of physical infrastructure, or the lack thereof. We ask you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge traditional territory outside your window, wherever that may be, and consider the planet's resources and invisible labor that buffers our present reality. The map you see of the current state of California projects a representation of fixed consumer broadband speeds across the state. Darker blues and purples are concentrated along the coast, and there are large gaps in service along the eastern portion of the state. So let's also take a moment to acknowledge how inequity in technological access is especially pronounced at this time in rural communities and households with Black, Latinx, and Native American learners. This is a societal, civic, and cultural problem with roots reaching back to the establishment of European colonies and perpetuated by the culture of white supremacy that continues to commodify public goods. Right, and the invitation for this talk was precipitated by an article entitled "When You Only Have a Week." We wrote this article last summer while reflecting on the work a handful of students, staff, and librarians at UCLA did to meet new and exacerbated challenges brought on by their remote pivot. Early in the pandemic, everyone was put in a stressful position. We acknowledged that resources were mixed among institutions, student needs were different in different institutions. So this talk isn't about precisely what we did or how to imitate it. It's going to be more about the infrastructure, foundations, and some of our personal and shared values that made the work possible. So as you join us for the rest of the talk, we ask you to reflect on how the outcomes of this work might look different for different institutions, meet your diverse needs, or align with personal or shared values. The paper highlighted two main projects or initiatives. The first one on the left-hand side of the screen was Remote Control, a rapidly developed webinar series meant to provide a space for newly remote students to learn new study strategies, commiserate, and discuss concerns that they had going forward with classes.
Hi everyone, this is Nisha, and the second image that's on the right was a series of online tutorials designed to help promote remote access. Remote access is something we've always taught. However, remote access now had a new meaning and new value during COVID. So there was a new urgency to demonstrate the value of what the library and VPN could provide for students. So today we're really grateful for this opportunity to examine and reflect on this work through the lens of the characteristics of white supremacy culture, which is cited here. During a time when everything felt urgent and we saw how COVID was mirroring white supremacist characteristics, we really wanted to examine the attributes of and antidotes to white supremacy culture addressed by Jones and Okun. So in this presentation, we're going to be highlighting 4 antidotes that aligned with our work early in the pandemic and also wouldn't have been possible without a foundation of empathetic and inclusive collaboration that had been laid over the preceding years. We also acknowledge that safety and security are foundational to learning and collaborating. So the 4 antidotes, which we will also refer to as values throughout this presentation that we're going to frame the presentation around, are centering learner voices, values-driven work, anti-perfectionism, and anti-hierarchical collaboration. So we'll talk about them starting with centering learner voices. So you can see in this image on the right, it's in the center because it's a value that we really consistently prioritize along with the other 3, which is being values-driven, anti-perfectionism, and anti-hierarchical, which are around it. And these all support the central value. So we'll be sharing how these values were demonstrated through voices on the team and examples of the work. And as you could see, the circles around the image are the individuals who came together to support this work and will be introduced next.
Everyone, good morning. It's great to be here. I'm Doug, and here are these people that the circles on the previous slide represent. This is the WIRE team from a pandemic-style group photo compiled in March of 2021. The slide was designed by Senjin Sen, who you'll hear from in just a bit. WIRE stands for Writing Instruction and Research Education. And as a team, we are focused on promoting inclusive excellence through the learner-led design of a wide variety of open access instructional materials and resources. We make short tutorials, interactive videos, online workshops, and most recently, there's a really great series of educational webcomics, which I encourage you to check out. On the WIRE team, we try to make sure that values infuse everything we do, from the approach we take to recruitment to the learner-led process we use to create instructional resources. As WIRE has grown, each cohort has helped shape and adapt these shared values, and I'm really excited that today you'll get to hear about the impact of this work directly from several of the people pictured here. When we wrote the When You Only Have a Week article, we were focusing on the frenzied week or so of activity that led to the development of Remote Control and WIRE's pandemic response online learning materials. But in reflecting on these things, we've realized that that week was only possible as a result of years of community building, collective learning, and the development of shared values and approaches. Looking back at our article now and through the lenses of our current experiences, we have to say we're not sure how we feel about the sense of urgency that drives the main narrative in the article. Getting to prepare this talk together has helped us realize how much the title of the article reads a bit like clickbait, and how in truth this work took much more than a week. To help contextualize this, we'd like to share on this slide the buildup of our learner-centered design process, which began way back in 2014 with the work of WIRE co-founder Renee Romero, who you'll hear from in a bit, as well as the publication of the WIRE Way Manifesto, which is the statement of shared values that continues to inspire our work together. And speaking of the WIRE Way, here's a short summary of it. Today's talk will be working on a collaborative exploration of 4 of the shared values in the WIRE Way that are highlighted on this slide. And we'll be reflecting on how they may resonate with the antidotes to white supremacy culture that's articulated in Jones and Okun. First, our aspiration to foster memorable, meaningful, and transformative learning through learner-led design, and as an essential element of that, pushing ourselves to truly center learners in all we do and resisting the limits imposed by traditional hierarchies in educational systems and libraries. Second, our commitment to build imperfect solutions quickly and on purpose, which will be discussed in our section on anti-perfectionism. And finally, two related points on speaking with our own voices and celebrating our diverse communities in our work, which I hope comes through in the approach we'll be taking in this talk, which we also take in many of our tutorials where many voices and perspectives come together to shape the narrative. Whenever we talk about the Wire Way, we like to emphasize how every group of people can come up with their own manifestos of shared values, and that there are many frameworks and examples that you can draw from. So as an example of that, next Nisha will share another possible framework.
Yeah, a lot of what I have been examining lately in the work I've been doing is how to be trauma informed in library work. And while we were developing this presentation, I noticed that the Wire Way's values and a lot of what we're going to be talking about resonated with trauma informed principles that have been developed between the CDC and SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So these 6 principles are: 1, safety. So that means physical, psychological, and emotional safety. 2, trustworthiness and transparency. 3, peer support. 4, collaboration and mutuality, which means working together for everyone's benefit. 5, empowerment, voice, and choice. So empowering everyone to have a voice and make choices, and that means choices that are actually possible and not just choices that are an illusion. And lastly, addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues. This wasn't intentional, but it really was refreshing to see how this was in alignment with what we were creating and what we have created. So next, we're going to go through these 4 values, imagining them as potential antidotes to white supremacy and also discussing how they guided the work that was done. So in each of these slides, you will see values or antidotes in black, and you'll see what we feel these values are an antidote to in blue. We took many of these words and phrases directly from Jones and Okun. So for this first one, we're going to start, we're starting with what was at the center of that image that we showed earlier, which was centering learner voices and experiences. Since the structure of this presentation will be centering the diverse learners and voices of who we work with rather than centering the institution. And to truly center these voices, you will hear from them throughout this presentation. And we want to add that when we talk about learners, we're talking about all of us, students, creators, library workers, because we all have something to learn for ourselves and from each other. And you'll also see that under each of these larger words are smaller words. And we see these words below them as different entry points or ways of knowing for the larger words. So for example, rather than centering the institution, it can also be thought of paternalism, library traditions and bureaucracies, being only information centered, only thinking and centering authority, thinking that there's only one right way, and commodification of difference. And we're going to discuss as an antidote, centering learner voices and experiences. So this can look and sound like lived experiences, being student-centered, critical pedagogy, truly listening and making space, decentering the library, and challenging vocational awe. And vocational awe was coined both by Fobazi Attar, and she speaks about it frequently. This was in The Library with the Lead Pipe, which is cited here, and I will drop these citations in the chat.
So first on this theme, we'll hear from Senjin Sen, who is one of the newest members of the WIRE team, and also a member of UCLA Library's truly extraordinary social media team.
Joining the WIRE team was definitely a super rewarding experience. There's always an inspiring spirit among our team. We can always bounce our ideas off of each other and give supportive feedback. I really like the idea of divergent thinking in the creative process and having a great team to spark new ideas. It also taught me to be creative in multiple ways and being able to apply my own experience as a learner when designing projects.
So I really love how this quote gives a behind-the-scenes look at the collaborative and social aspects of WIRE's creative process. And it also gives us a sense of how the learners designers as a cohort work together to make sure all of their voices are heard and valued. Next, WIRE co-founder Renee Romero, who I think is in the audience today, expands on this idea in this quote on WIRE's shared value to celebrate diverse campus communities.
I'm really happy to be part of a team that works to celebrate and highlight diverse communities and voices in academic materials. It is rare to see positive and authentic representation of yourself when you are part of an underrepresented group, and it becomes really tiring to see inclusion that is really just a tokenization of your community. I love that the WIRE team intentionally seeks to highlight the many faces, voices, and experiences of the UCLA community in the materials that we make and the hidden challenges that we address. When you see people who look like you navigating academia and overcoming similar challenges, it helps you say, I can do it too.
So Sinjin and Renee's quotes together show two very important ways that WIRE strives to center learner voices and experiences. First, the voices, experiences, and expertise of our learner designers themselves are centered in the design process. And at the same time, we seek to celebrate and represent our diverse campus communities through authentic representation in the instructional materials that we create. Here's a quick example of how this all plays out in practice. So for our remote access article that inspired this talk, we created a learner-centered entry point to our campus IT's technical documentation for remote access. We did this by creating 4 learner narratives from different students on campus who each use a different approach to remote access for electronic resources. These first-person narratives from a diverse group of students on campus help to personalize, contextualize, and increase the relevance and relatability of what might otherwise be dry and distancing technical documentation.
So at UCLA, much of the campus effort during the remote shift was focused on making instructors remote ready by way of technological proficiency and home office setups. And so early on, there was also little analogous effort for students. We saw this as an opportunity for the library to provide responsive programming. The UCLA first year office completed a short, limited survey of students and their concerns during their first few days of remote learning. It was very informal. So we had some anecdotal idea of student concerns, but this was the first bit of evidence that really filtered down to us in the library. There were some themes. We noticed a good deal of anxiety from students regarding new learning spaces, technology, and interactions with professors and authority, as well as the ability to connect with fellow students, TAs, and professors. Students were also concerned about success and moving goalposts in the new environment. So this is just a word cloud, the responses. Thanks. So this is just a snapshot of the remote control webinar series here. We did a number of different webinars from making connections, so showing students strategies for connecting with fellow students, connecting with TAs, building a mentorship relationship with faculty or TA, that sort of thing, strategies for managing remote classes, reading efficiently, staying on track later, sort of thing. So that's linked. Just to have some idea of what we did. And in our remote control making connections webinar, we focused on highlighting the lived experiences of students and amplifying their voices and concerns. On this slide, we provided conversation starters or tips for setting boundaries in the new learning environment. And we also opened the floor to students in the webinar to discuss strategies they'd employed or barriers to setting those boundaries. Students had also expressed some trepidation about contacting their professors and TAs. They were afraid that an inability to turn on their cameras or participate at certain times would reflect poorly on their dedication to the work, or they wouldn't be able to build that close relationship with mentors. So we used some WIRE tutorials to outline strategies for contacting professors and TAs, including sample text. It's a great, cross-promotional addition.
So next, we're going to talk about being values-driven rather than being outcomes-driven. And we talk about being outcomes-driven as another way of saying quantity over quality, that there's only one right way, centering the product over the process, that progress has to be bigger and more, and discomfort with feelings. And while it's not that outcomes don't matter, it's more that using values to drive the work and care for students was very central to the input and success of this work. Shared values helped create the foundation of what we were able to create and made sure that in a time of urgency, we were, as you could see, with values driven and the smaller words, we were grounded, guided, we had shared values, we were being more critical and reflective, as well as being engaged.
The foundational role of values in WIRE's creative process is summed up very well in this quote by Neha Gupta, who's another new member of the WIRE creative team.
As a new member of the team, one thing that has been most striking to me is the emphasis on expressing values through design. The WIRE Manifesto sets the tone for each project, and it's extremely refreshing to work in an environment driven by collaborative feedback and improvement rather than criticism and stress. In my opinion, this atmosphere breeds both productivity and creativity, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be part of it.
I really like how Neha's quote here highlights how the WIRE team tries to make sure that values drive every aspect of our work together. At WIRE, we definitely care about learning outcomes. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, it is our shared values that serve as a foundation for what we do and how we work together. In other areas of my library work, I feel like discussions of values have been confined. Maybe that's with a specific committee or maybe to a certain phase or aspect of a project. And I think that WIRE's work together shows that that doesn't need to be the case, that we can make our values an integral part of all of our day-to-day work together. To expand on this idea, next we'll hear from Hannah Sutherland, who's a WIRE learner designer and also the instructional design and technology consultant for Powell Library, who builds on this idea.
The WIRE way of providing empathetic feedback at all stages of a project has shown me what a gift it is to be vulnerable with your team and with your work. I no longer agonize over whether a project is done, but instead, I consider whether it has incorporated as many voices as possible.
I love Hannah's insight here because I think it illustrates how a values-driven approach can fundamentally shift and reframe every aspect of a project, even at the level of redefining the whole idea of done. In other words, we can redefine done, and it can be based on something other than the outcomes and metrics. It can be based on something like values, and in this case, our shared value to incorporate multiple voices and perspectives in the process. Also essentially important here, and something that we'll continue to talk about in this talk today, is Hannah's discussion of vulnerability and the ability to be vulnerable with your team and your work. I think that's truly a gift, and unfortunately, I think it is a gift that we don't give each other often enough. We need to do that more often.
To respond to the anxiety felt by students early on in the pandemic, remote control sessions were grounded in empathy and reinforced the message that campus was a community. This was a shared experience and students' concerns were valid. Safety and security, as we said, is a foundation for learning or a prerequisite for creating a secure collaborative environment. When these sessions first took place in late March, early April, a time when there was still a good deal of confusion about how long students would be remote, how classes would work, etc., this type of messaging was important. When we were crafting the webinars, outcomes were on the periphery. We were primarily concerned with creating a space for students to instill community values and remind them that they were part of a community that could support them by helping them with resources and adaptive strategies. As you can see from the session goals on this slide, the meta slides, the shared values were the foundation, and it was integral to establish these in each session before we attended to any granular details. I particularly liked, motivating yourself, making a plan for success, whatever that means for you in that moment.
And I think this is a really compelling example from the WIRE team as well. Sometimes placing values over outcomes can even mean overtly critiquing the curriculum itself. This is an example tutorial about timed testing, strategies for taking time tests, that was created by the WIRE learner designers in collaboration with student employees at UCLA's Powell Library. And as we worked through the design process for this project, the learner designers realized they wanted to address issues of inequity in time testing. And so they wrote what I think is a beautiful author's note at the end of the tutorial, which I'll read a section of. Instructors and educational institutions need to critically evaluate, if not outright remove, timed exams as a method of evaluation. The inherent concerns of this style of testing on certain groups of students during normal times are only compounded by the current pandemic, which has laid bare the disproportionate impact remote learning has had on some members of our collegiate student body. So in this case, centering learner voices also involves amplifying their concerns and calling into question traditional practices.
As Wynn shared earlier when describing one of the remote control sessions, and as we've all probably experienced during the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty about what might happen, and in many ways there still is. So it was really important to focus on the fact that it was okay to not know and for everyone to meet themselves where they were at. And while not knowing can be very unsettling, using the value of anti-perfectionism as a way to guide this work was very important because perfection is colonial and denotes a false binary of failure and success. Perfection can also refer to a lack of appreciation, pointing out inadequacies, people being quote unquote wrong and focusing on the quote unquote wrong, feeling that mistakes are very personal, there being a lack of time for reflection, as well as worship for the written word. Instead, we'd like to think of anti-perfectionism in terms of, our favorite Bob Ross's happy accidents, making generative mistakes, a culture of appreciation, a focus on learning and breakthroughs, as well as purposeful experimentation.
Starting off our discussion on anti-perfectionism is Symphony Dean Pfeiffer, a recent UCLA grad who's been working on a fantastic new series of STEM tutorials for Wire.
This is my first time in such a safe, accepting environment where I've had the agency to create to my heart's content. I love the skills I've gained, the projects I've made, and the fact that everyone can contribute their thoughts and ideas to each project. I'm my own worst critic, so the anti-perfectionism value has been amazing for me and has allowed me to explore a more curious side of myself. I'm more open to trying new things and being okay with asking for help.
So one thing I want to highlight here, one thing I really love about this quote is how it helps us think about anti-perfectionism as an environmental factor, as something that we can cultivate together and help foster for each other when we work and learn together in community. For me, this quote really shows that when we actively counter perfectionism in our learning and work environments, we can make a big difference for each other and open up new pathways for curiosity and creativity. We see a related perspective from Kian Revai, who is Wire's lead instructional design assistant and has been an absolutely prolific contributor to the Wire team in every way. I encourage you to check out his portfolio page on the Wire website. It's amazing. Kian shares how anti-perfectionist values can have an impact even beyond the team environment.
Wire's philosophy of creating imperfect solutions quickly and on purpose has helped me in every area of my life. Certainly as an instructional designer, but also as a composer, a student, and a person in various social relationships. I don't have to get anything perfect the first time around. There's freedom in knowing I'll always have the opportunity to revise.
When I listen to this quote, I think this is what we hope for, that our learning and our work together can have meaning and value within and beyond our campuses and libraries.
The way these anti-perfectionist values played into remote control is through a focus on generative mistakes and a focus on learning and breakthroughs. We focused on spinning challenges into opportunities, acknowledging that we didn't have perfect solutions for everything. Things that had seemed particularly worrying to students in the first year experience survey were framed as challenges with different possible solutions, but never just one solution. We included spaces like, how can we make the most of this? Throughout the presentation to open the floor for student discussion. During the remote control webinars, these slides serve to open the space, even if we weren't fully prepared for what happened if we did. We weren't and still aren't experts, but creating this space for students, especially in the early days, was important. As instructors, we had to be flexible and demonstrate our own fears and vulnerabilities. We were facing some overlapping challenges and were upfront about our quest for opportunities.
Before I get into this slide, I do want to call out what Annette mentioned, that the background of Doug's Zoom is a Bob Ross painting that his son did. And as we were meeting throughout this whole process of creating this presentation, he always had a different background because his son was doing them every day. So I'd like to think that that was also inspiring us as we were creating this presentation. So what we have been hearing and what Wynn just explained reiterates the importance of centering students and also allowing for others to lead and for there to be a more flattened structure, which brings us to examining hierarchy and anti-hierarchy. So other entry points for hierarchy include power hoarding, a fear of open conflict, paternalism, being very focused on degree and status, individualism, defensiveness, which can often result from it, and bureaucracy. And as for anti-hierarchy, we are referring to feminist governance, being collectivist and community-based, being more egalitarian and horizontal in terms of structure, which can often be more equitable, and valuing relationships over bureaucracy. And I want to add a note about bureaucracy, specifically a shout out to the article Nice White Meetings, Unpacking Absurd Library Bureaucracy Through a Critical Race Theory Lens by Lalitha Nutraj, Holly Hampton, Talitha Maitland, Yvonne Nalani Mulemans, which I'll put in the chat. It is a great article that talks about how bureaucracy can honestly be very traumatizing and challenging for all library workers, especially Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color.
So starting off our discussion on hierarchy and anti-hierarchy in libraries is Christopher Lopez, a learner designer with WIRE, also an MLAS graduate student, and also the WIRE team member who's been spearheading our webcomics effort. Chris is a public service assistant at the Young Research Library.
In a professional context where job classification and school degree determine what I can or cannot do and how colleagues perceive my potential, the WIRE ethos has been a breath of fresh, empowering air. I never doubt my voice being taken seriously by my fellow designers, which allows me to share my perspective freely. This egalitarian context erodes the competitive, self-sufficient mindset academic libraries usually engender, orienting me towards a more collaborative, empathetic way of doing library work for and with others.
So when I listen to this quote, I can really feel how our library assistants and graduate student employees are right in the middle of so many harmful power dynamics within libraries. There's a lot to take in this quote, and for me, it's another reminder that the deep hierarchical structures within our libraries are harmful for all and disproportionately harmful for vulnerable populations. I think it also shows the power and importance of creating even small pockets of space within libraries that resist these traditional hierarchies. This anti-hierarchical stance is something that we can do for each other when we build teams and communities. Michael Lima Sabatini shares a similar perspective from his lens as an undergraduate student. Michael's an inquiry specialist at Powell Library and has collaborated with the WIRE team on several projects, including our pandemic response tutorials.
Collaborating with professional staff and feeling like a valuable, co-equal contributor gives new meaning to the work. I felt much more confident sharing my ideas, and I think having that level playing field made me more open to constructive feedback because I felt like I was being approached as a respected colleague, not a naive student.
Just to follow up and explain a little bit more about the Inquiry Specialist program, Inquiry Specialists are undergraduate and graduate student employees who help out in a variety of contexts, from UCLA's first year experience coursework on to research assistants and instruction and outreach. They just contribute so much to public services at UCLA Library. So this quote is an excerpt from a longer quote that appears in our article. And I think for me, it highlights how resisting hierarchy can also involve resisting the deep traditions of paternalism, which are so prevalent at all levels of education. And also, I think that paternalism is a very frequent experience, unfortunately, for our library student employees. I think it's possible to break these things down, and as Michael says, level the playing field by treating our library student employees as respected colleagues. And here's how Renee, WIRE's co-founder, sums it all up.
I think many teams strive to create the kind of culture and community where every voice is valued and all feedback matters equally. But it is difficult to live out, as the structures we build in higher education often prioritize competition and hierarchy as a way to show expertise and skill level. I really appreciate that each person on the WIRE team is committed to making an anti-hierarchical work climate, where it does not matter if you are a student, staff, librarian, campus partner, etc. Your input, perspective, and skills matter as much as every other member of the team. You are not constrained by traditional hierarchies. I learn so much from every person I work with, and I love knowing that I'm part of a team of people who care about each other and enjoy learning and growing together.
I think that's the mic drop moment. I think Renee really says it all in that quote.
Yeah, that in hearing that in all these students, it really actually makes me emotional because it really, what she says really does sum it up, and their voices are just so important to hear. And preparing this presentation really gave us the opportunity to reflect on our work together. If we weren't actually asked to do this, we wouldn't have reflected as much at all. So when we were thinking of takeaways from this presentation, we also were trying to examine what happens when we don't reflect or move forward. And we thought about the word inertia, which can also look like stagnation, a sense of urgency, valuing quantity over quality, simplifying complexity, a fear of open conflict, discomfort avoidance, defensiveness, a fear of change, and being passive. And what we strive for with considering takeaways looks like being reflective with reflections, learning as well as unlearning, understanding what the tie-ins and connections are, imagining different possibilities, and envisioning next steps as well as moving forward. So mental health during the pandemic. A big takeaway from this presentation is really about safety as well, which I mentioned in the beginning and we've been mentioning throughout. And it really aligns with mental health and overall well-being. In this report, the quote on the left comes from a KFF, a Kaiser Family Foundation report titled The Implications of COVID-19 for Mental Health and Substance Abuse. And it says that during the pandemic, about 4 in 10 adults in the US have reported symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder, a share that has been largely consistent, up from 1 in 10 adults who reported these symptoms from January to June of 2019. And a very large source of these mental health challenges is linked to isolation and job loss. And hearing feedback from the students about feeling safe, accepted, and working collaboratively, even remotely, feels very promising during this time of uncertainty and loss.
In the context of safety, it's also important to talk about defensiveness within the institution and acknowledge that change or creating these safe pockets of collaboration isn't easy. White supremacy culture is set up to protect itself and the power as it exists. Many new initiatives are subject to increased scrutiny. So reflecting on the ways in which we reactively defend ourselves has encouraged us to rethink the ways we interact with labor within the library, especially student labor. By caring for our student employees and each other in the workplace, working to level perceived hierarchies, we have the opportunity to create more responsive programming and shared community values. But this doesn't happen overnight. Gatekeeping ideas is one strategy employed to protect power structures. In our institution, it takes a ton of emotional work to pitch and promote a new idea. Even if ideas are born from a collective, there's often an administrative bottleneck seen as distinct from the unit. As you saw from the timeline earlier in the presentation, it took years for WIRE's culture of collaboration to mature. As part of that transition required creating and protecting a pocket of space that maybe didn't completely align with the existing organizational ways of thinking. both Wire and Remote Control were grassroots initiatives. With Remote Control, there was minimal administrative pushback. There was a lot going on, though there was anxiety that there would be some pushback. These initiatives took a good deal of emotional labor to get off the ground, and it took a lot of time, and all credit goes to the collective.
And now for the meme I know you've all been waiting for, my favorite distracted boyfriend meme. So being values driven has been a huge theme from this talk, as is illustrated here. And this is all to say that rethinking assessment in the context of values rather than only outcomes, and using values to inform learning outcomes, can provide a more robust, grounded way to move forward with reference, instruction, outreach, programming, and library services in general. And as you can see on the side, so starting with values can be grounding for individuals and groups. Using outcomes as a frequent starting point can lean on capitalistic notions of productivity, comparison, and it also relies on external validation and performance. So values can really inform the practical, and if only outcomes inform the practical, quality and care often can get lost in that process.
As we work together on this talk, another of our takeaways came as a result of collecting the quotes that we've all been hearing today. These quotes reinforce for us how distinct Wire and Remote Control are from the larger library organization, and how they are in many ways safe havens. I was happy about that because I think we need spaces like Wire and projects like Remote Control, but I was also sad about it as well because it seems that in libraries we may not have enough of these spaces. I felt this need at a personal level recently, for sure, because having joined a new organization, I'm currently having to go wireless for a time. That was a pun, sorry about that, but it hasn't been easy, and I miss Wire. So overall, I think the main message here today is that it is possible to create pockets of safety and inclusion within our libraries. These pockets can be driven by shared values that work every day to counter perfectionism and hierarchy, and that we really can foster a continual focus on centering and amplifying learner voices. The Showing Up for Racial Justice framework we've been discussing today speaks of antidotes to white supremacy. We hope that in imagining some of these potential antidotes with us today, you've found a few things that might be relevant and impactful in your organization. And we know you're very likely doing much of this and more in your organizations. So with that in mind, we'd love to foster conversation with you about values in the workplace, whether that means individually on small project teams, within your units, or within the organization as a whole.
So speaking of these conversations, a guiding question we ask you to consider is, what is the role of values in our work? So this image here is a visual representation of how your values as an individual may or may not align with your department, your organization, and your institution. And of course, this can really vary depending on your setting. While your values don't have to be the same as others, there is something to be said for values feeling in alignment with your colleagues, your department, and organization. It's also really important to feel safe enough to state and stand by your values. And it's also, I think, very important to have a feeling of safety in order to be vulnerable. So as you can see on this slide, the circle represents the institution. There's a representation for the organization, the department, and the individual. And I think it can be really helpful to imagine how this can look for you and your organization. And this is a static image that is definitely meant to shift. It's a fluid representation that can really differ and change based on the culture, leadership, and needs of you and your organization. So with this in mind, here are some key questions to think about in terms of the role of values in your work. 1, how do your values influence your work? 2, do you feel that you can talk about your values in the workplace? 3, do your values align with your colleagues, your department, or your organization? And 4, do you feel that you can be empowered to contribute shared values to your organization? Asking these questions can really help you know where you're starting from and to reground the work you do. So feel free to reflect upon these and even ask us questions during the Q&A, which is basically going to start very soon. I'm going to drop a link in the chat with a list of all the resources we mentioned and showed, and they're also on the next slide. So yes, thank you so much. We love Bitmojis, so we had to incorporate that here, and we're really excited to hear your questions.
Yeah,
and thanks for
I'm peeing myself so that I can appear on the screen. I'm going to read the questions, and right now we have 4 of them. I just want to thank you for your presentation. I saw the article almost a year ago, and I think it was just sort of one of the pieces that really spoke to me about, the transition we were all going to. And so I was just really glad that you guys took this on as a keynote talk. And I'm really glad that it, prompted you to reflect and really think about what, how you brought these ideas forward to be able to accomplish what you did. Let's see. I don't know if I was really low. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with one of the beefier questions, and it's from Lori, and she says, I have advocated using Jones and Okun's work to shape reflection and conversation at my institution, a community college, but haven't succeeded in sparking much interest among colleagues. I wonder if academics consider the dismantling racism curriculum as insufficiently grounded in research. Do you have thoughts on this, advice for engaging others in this work?
I can think of a couple things. One is that, one thing as a health sciences librarian that I've often thought about in terms of evidence-based research is that, in terms of like an evidence-based pyramid about, narratives and, the N equals 1 being on the bottom, I think lived experiences are still very, very important. And as you build more and more lived experiences and listen to those, that ends up being evidence. And I think that that's really important to consider. I also think another way to look at this is to think about, or you can lead with the values that are characteristics of white supremacy, like looking at how perfectionism shows up in the workplace, looking at hierarchy, and really being reflective, maybe not so much, and this really depends on the person, everyone's in a different place, but not so much pointing fingers as much as, I think we've all done that. I know I've done that. I think that that's just something that as humans, sometimes we can be quick to blame, but maybe bring it as more of a conversation. It's like, how are we fostering for perfectionism here? What are ways that we have been anti-perfectionist, and how has that been helpful? So really leading with those different values and characteristics, as opposed to just saying that this is, white supremacy, even though I think it's very important to call that and name that, definitely, but really focusing on how it looks in your organization, as opposed to just saying that, this is racist, XYZ. I think you have to bring it all together to see how it looks for the whole organization. But I'm happy to hear what my colleagues think as well.
I completely agree, but I think it's important to maybe use it as an entry point too, and maybe not all of the like attributes or notes in the article will be applicable to your organization. So use it as a tool to find entry points and stimulate conversation in that way.
Yeah. Do you want me to go to the next question? Okay. Thank you for that. I'd love to hear, so the next question is from Odile. I hope I'm saying your name right. I'd love to hear more about the formats, structures, media you use to get input and share feedback.
I think I can try the beginning of that one. And what I can do is bring up a website, which I'll also post in the chat. This is called Foundations in Learner-Centered Design. And this has 2 really useful things here. One is it's our entire training program on learner-centered design. And the second thing in the direct answer to your question is under design process. This section contains a whole bunch of our tools and techniques for both the design process and for gathering feedback. So just to make a quick answer to that question, I'll drop the link to Foundations in the chat for everyone.
And I want to add to that question. I've been dabbling in design thinking. And so I want to, would you address like, what does a prototype look like? Because I think prototypes really shift how we, how as librarians, we usually do our work, right? We just build and then share and we're done. Maybe sometimes we might edit things, but what does a prototype look like in your context?
So I put an example here up on the screen. I hope that's showing up for everyone, but we do tons of paper prototyping in Wire. So a prototype, this is a prototype, a very early prototype of a tutorial on primary and secondary sources, which has become one of our most popular tutorials. And you could see it began with index cards just sketched out on paper. This is a good example of the process. We would put the index cards in front of students. We worked with students together. Students were the designers and gave us feedback throughout the process. And we would work right with the index cards as if that's what you're seeing on the screen. So prototypes can be very simple. They can be very fast and rapid to produce. And it makes a big difference because you're not always engaging with this full digital creative infrastructure. I think it's liberating to work with paper and pencil in many ways. Hope that answers the question, Annette.
Yeah, I think so. I love the paper sort of, kind of comic or storyboard. Well, so the questions are kind of hopping now. And I think, so Amber asked a question, this idea of the right to comfort is so poignant, and I think it ties to defensiveness. Many organizations have spaces or teams for social justice and discussing social justice values elsewhere, elsewhere may be seen as intrusive. Sorry, I'm not sure. And discussing social justice values elsewhere may be seen as intrusive or not the right forum. How do you deal with the idea that social justice can exist in certain forums rather than everyday conversations?
Yeah, actually, I saw this really great tweet yesterday that this is making me think about. Yeah, Doug, I saw that you liked it. And it talked about how a lot of library students, and I wish I knew the person offhand. I'll try to look really quick and link the tweet and put it in the chat. But how a lot of library students, BIPOC library students, are really worried about having to do the diversity work, which is totally valid. And what this person reflected on was that if you want equity, if your ethics and your values are equity, you will somehow end up doing that work. And I really think that it's important to think about libraries sharing information as something that is naturally equitable. Yet there are ways that it somehow, because of bureaucracy, because of white supremacist institutions, because of all the things that it kind of starts going a different way, as well as just how librarianship was honestly built. So if our main basis for what all of us do, regardless of our identity, is equity and trying to break down those barriers and realizing where we can have some humility and knowing that we don't know and we have a lot to unlearn, then I really think that, that's the conversation. Social justice then is in everything. It's one of my friends, when I really started kind of getting more into social justice, told me that you can't, saying that you're not political is a political statement, that politics is in the air we breathe, And I think that going at it from that angle is really important to consider. Oh, thank you, Alex. I think Alex put the tweet in the chat. That really blew me away. It said so much about how if the work we want to do is going to be equitable, then that's the work we're doing. It's going to be social justice centered no matter what.
Great, thank you. So I want to turn this a little bit in a different direction, and that is Callie's question, which is also super important, I think, is how did you recruit students to join in this wonderful project, on this wonderful project?
I will try to get a link to this if I can to share. But we focus a lot on recruitment, and one of the things we did was we created a front end to the typical HR job posting. You know, we created something that was much more inclusive, much more welcoming. We emphasized that you know, we had heard that it might look like a technology job. So we really emphasized that it was about curiosity, that you can apply, you know, you don't need previous experience with technology. Instead, just bring a passion for learning and helping others. So we did a lot of work to reframe the job call. And then we worked with our campus partners, made connections with our current student employees to do a really active outreach program, so that we were really making sure that diverse communities on campus knew about this opportunity. And then the third thing we've always done is collect narratives like what you've heard today that we make part of the recruitment process. So when you're applying for one of these jobs, you get to see and hear from other people who've had the job before and get a sense of what the experience is like. And I think all of that leads to a much more inclusive recruitment process. I think it makes a huge difference.
That's really great. I know it can be challenging to sort of align skills and interests with being actually kind of being able to jump in and sort of take on the role. And what I am sensing from the people who we heard from today in your presentation was that they were ready to meet the challenge. So that's a really nice alignment. I think I'm going to stick with that theme, and Odile has a follow-up question. I'm also curious about the pure logistics. Does the whole group meet at set times? Does the project lead invite others to a feedback session?
Should I take that one too? I feel like I might be talking too much, but I'll try to make it quick. Yes, you know, we've adapted our logistics a lot over time. When we were all in the same place, there was a lot of informal communication happening, but switching to remote has made a bigger need to kind of have set weekly meetings and things like that. So we moved from a previously like very organic sort of framework to something that's a bit more structured. And then another thing I like to say is that we try to seek to have a really well-designed creative process. So the process is really well designed, but within that process, there's tons of creative freedom. And I think the best way to learn about it is to just take a look at the foundation site, which really kind of walks through the whole design process that Wire uses.
Yeah, I will say about Wire, especially like with the remote pivot, there's just a lot of documentation available and step-by-step processes. So a lot of work can be done asynchronously, but still kind of on the rails. And it makes meetings a lot more efficient that way. So it's not just, I don't know, it works kind of like a machine, but there's been a lot of work to build towards that.
Great. So I'm picking another question from Gina Kessler, who was has been in CCLI before and was a former chair. And her question is, it sounds like from your team's quotes, you did an excellent job of not just stating these really worthwhile values, but also really living them. Can you speak to some concrete ways you acted on one of these values? Like, how do you normalize anti-perfectionism as a team? It's been a while since I read your article. Forgive me if this is addressed there.
I could talk a little bit about that. I feel that, you know, while it's true, you can have these set values and then totally get away from it. But I really think it's aligning the actions with the words, you know, like we talk about actions speak louder than words, but really aligning them together. And I felt like, you know, one thing that was on that page that Doug shared was like the empathy map, for example. It's using like a value of empathy to drive the work that you're doing, to create the work that you're doing. So having tools that you are using to create whatever you're going to create, I think is great. And so much of the process is also iterative. So they'll make something and then get feedback and make it again. And they might have like a date, like, okay, let's try to have this by this date. And if it's not perfect, it's okay. And that I felt like I kept hearing from Doug. I kept hearing from the students. I heard that from Renee. And I feel like those very strong values, you know, one thing that I talk about when I taught my trauma-informed library course is that it's not just about applying things within libraries, it's about actually being that way yourself and also reflecting on it and saying like, oh shoot, I think that's perfectionistic of me. And I feel like that's something I very much observed with Wire. Whenever I was at a meeting, I just felt like there was a lot of joking, joy, and there was a lot of trust. And I feel like those things are really important to have. And it just was so much there in action from the get-go.
Yeah, just an understanding that the work is a process.
Yeah. Okay, so another technical question. What audio tool do you use when you capture students' voices on the slides?
It's an interesting question because, you know, as part of the process, all of the students do audio recording. That's part of their, you know, experiences. And we use a lot of tools. One of our, you know, ideas is just to work with what you have on hand. So I'm pretty sure most of the audio recordings you heard today were done on a phone. They were transferred to me in a bunch of different formats. When we're all in the same space together, we have like a nice microphone and we use some software called Audacity. But when we're remote, everybody's using something different. And I thought it was great. I thought that, you know, everything sounded really good, and it just shows that it's been possible to do this transition to distributed creativity, which is fun to hear.
And
never one solution.
Sorry. Yeah, that's great. I like that. It's very inclusive. So an anonymous attendee asks, and I think that you may have sort of covered this in the shared values, but I think there might be another layer here. I was wondering, how do you do this if some team members are not on board or are skeptical about having shared values, or even question some of these anti-racist, anti-capitalist values? I think sometimes we have to work with people who, you know, have different mindsets. So.
I mean, I think that's really hard, and I think we'd all have a different answer to that. But I think one thing that we came back to time and time again was creating a pocket of safety and finding people that you can safely and productively collaborate with, and, you know, working with those people. And you don't always have the option. You know, you work with everyone, and you find a way to work with everyone. But I think finding a collective is important. You know, finding allies in the workplace and finding people that you want to work with and want to, you know, build up is important.
Great. Okay, so I have one last. Oh, was there another responder?
I was just going to say that I think it's, you know, while sometimes we don't want to meet people where they're at when their values are like antithetical to you, I do think it's really important to think of things like relationally. You know, how is what I'm doing affecting you? How is what you're doing affecting me? And let's try it to see what happens. I know that's like easier said than done, but I think coming from that relational lens, and where in my experience in librarianship, I have seen a lot of like territoriality. And I think that it's really important to think about how all of what we all do affects each other can be an important way to look at it too.
So we have one last question, and I don't think it's a lightweight question, but we're going to try it anyway. So it's from Swati, and the question is, I'm a little confused about white supremacy being perfectionist. Could you explain what you mean by that? Literally speaking, would non-white be imperfect?
I think that a lot of what comes with white supremacy is the idea of capitalism and colonization, colonialism, which to me are inseparable. They kind of happened together, right? And so when I think about those, I think of that product versus the process. And if you think about it like purely from like economical standpoint, I'm not an economist or an expert on that, but like if you have a perfect product, it has to be perfect. And the productivity to create that product has to be perfect. We have to constantly maximize efficiency. Thinking about it from that level and thinking about also not thinking about how I think framing it as how imperfection has value too, and how that is part of the process and being more learning oriented, I think is a really important way to look at it. And so it's kind of goes along with all these other concepts that we're talking about. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's not like literally speaking, it's not what we intend. We're basing it off the Showing Up for Racial Justice, white supremacy cultural characteristics site that was linked. So we're referring to like a culture of, appreciation or lack thereof, and the process how that's processed.
I also want to add that the question being like perfect versus imperfect, to me, that's kind of a false binary. Because you can look at perfection and then you could look like what Wynn just mentioned in terms of culture of appreciation. It's not necessarily that non-white people are imperfect. It's more of the idea of what white supremacy represents and how it affects all of us, regardless of how we identify racially, right? It affects the way our work ethic is. It affects how things are structured, how organizations are structured, the expectations that we have for what we're supposed to produce. So I think thinking about that, not so much as just like individuals, but more as a collective, and how that as a structure comes down on us in terms of expectations and outcomes.
Yeah, and I think equity speaking, perfectionism, can be unstated and leave people guessing, what is expected of them. I think that's an issue that I think a lot of us have dealt with. Well, those were all the questions. I just want to thank you. And if we were all in person, we would be giving you a round of applause. So if you want to put in your emoji applause, that would be appreciated. And yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to be our keynote. We're very honored that you did this. And so that concludes this talk. And I just want to mention what's coming up next at 10:30 is Find and Let In Presenters. And that is by Annie Fo, Nikki Andrews, and Charlotte Rowe, who are all co-presenting. And I'll put the link for that talk in the chat. So we'll see you back at 10:30. Thank you, everyone.
Yay, thank you, Doug, Lynn, and Nisha.
Woot woot.